Welcome back to Radio ATN here at our 2023 Creating Trauma Sensitive Schools Conference. My name is Danny Pancratz. I'm a board member for ATN, and I'm happy to be joined by Doris and Rick Bowman from Bowman Consulting to talk about a couple of their sessions that the one they're doing for us this year, one they've done previously for us at the conference. They're also related to some of the consulting services that they do. So this year's session and name of one of your trainings is I'm a teacher, not a therapist, which I think a lot of our attendees and our audience probably relates to. But can you share a little bit about the inspiration for that title and then also what the training involves?
Absolutely. Do you want me to share
that?
Go
ahead.
I mean, the inspiration really came actually sitting in an IEP meeting. A meeting around a functional behavior assessment and behavior plan, talking about the needs of a student and hearing a teacher say that for, well, I've heard it many times in many meetings. And so as I thought about it, I saw kind of the reactions around the room and people feeling like that teacher maybe was being inflexible, uncaring about what the student needed, unwilling to provide what the child needed. And what I started reflecting and really thinking about was that what she was really expressing was that she felt unequipped, that she felt some sense of fear that she would fail, that she had not been trained to do what she felt she was being asked to do. And so we felt like it was important to kind of define, like, the children that have had trauma impacts, maybe have attachment issues, do have some different needs. Some of those are appropriately met by a therapist, but there are many, many, many that are appropriately able to be met within a classroom setting by a teacher and without adding to their workload. And so that's been a big part of our commitment and promise in bringing this session and the training that we do, is that we want to bring staff things that they can do without adding more layers to the hard work that they're already doing.
Yeah, I think that part over the last couple of years at this conference, that sentiment of I'm a teacher, not a therapist, as much as people are connected to this work and are valuing the trainings and resources they're getting in sessions or like through service providers like you all, but they think about, oh, well, where am I going to find the time? I'm already struggling to keep up with things. So that sounds really positive and productive to work it into their approach already. So what are some of the things in particular that you're going to be talking about in your session tomorrow, or that people who work with you on that training going to kind of dive into to go to the next step for that?
Yeah. Do you want to share something?
One of the things I think that's so vitally important is an understanding that kids with toxic stress and trauma, that trauma creates this disconnection, this disruption of connection. And of course, we all want connection. But when there's trauma, because of this disruption of connection, the child goes into a protective state. And oftentimes I think it's hard for teachers to understand that when they ask a child to meet just a simple expectation and the child comes back with some form of challenging behavior, that it's not about them. Mm-hmm. That if they do it in some specific ways that the science shows that are very powerful, and they don't focus on the behavior, but they focus on the process of working with them and building that connection with the child. I mean, that's one of the big things that we really talk a lot about. And then there's the other thing that goes along with predictability. Mm-hmm. If you're predictable in the way you approach the child in a very neutral, kind of invitational way, we know that the science shows us again that that's very regulating for the nervous system. And so after time, just by doing these simple things, just by approaching a child and say, hey, seems like you're having a difficult time with this. Help me understand why. How can I help you? Those sort of regulating, empathetic questions, rather than going directly at the cortex and going, why aren't you getting that done?
Yeah.
Is
why aren't you listening to me?
Yeah, why aren't you listening to me? Which may be true at the time, but it's not the way to build. It's not the way to regulate the child's stress response system. And so we know that teachers can, and this is out of the work from Dr. Bruce Perry, that, these small relational doses of stress throughout the day over time makes the child's stress response system less vulnerable to stress and more resilient to it. And these are things that teachers can do throughout the day. This is not a clinical thing. It's just having an intent that I'm going to dose this child with some really good relational pattern, moderate stress, and probably the stress that they did not get in their childhood, haven't gotten. And that if I do this over and over and over again, then the nervous system is going to feel that I'm trustworthy, that I'm predictable, that I'm safe.
And still allowing them to be teachers.
And still allowing them to be teachers. And as you said, one of the things that we heard a lot of a few years ago when we first started training was time. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and time is a real issue. But these are things that you can do right. The things that we're going to talk about are things you can do in the classroom throughout the day that don't take any additional time at all.
And I think one of the things that we emphasize most is that there are certain things that we ask staff to think through their day and proactively set their day up in a way that the best way I can describe it is one of the images that we have in our slide deck is of an IV drip, right? And we like to think about an IV drip of regulation throughout a child's day, and there's specific ways that we can do that, like the type of interactions that Rick was talking about are one way that we can do that. There are many other ways, so that instead of waiting for the child to show us with their behavior that, hey, now I'm dysregulated, we are actually doing things all throughout the day to help them maintain a certain level of regulation. They're much less likely then to reach that point. And then we also have tools to use to help the child be able to show us, right? Be able to understand, first of all, where they're at. Second of all, show us or communicate to us where they're at and get the help and the support that they need.
A question for you both. I think I mentioned that I've heard that phrase, I'm a teacher, not a therapist, for many years, dating back over the 6 years of this conference. But it's been a challenging last couple of years. And I know I've personally in my life heard an uptick of that from the teachers that I know, that their jobs have really changed and evolved. And so how have you seen that change for the people you've worked with over the last couple of years?
Well, I think it's changed. I mean, my personal, how I'm viewing it is that we've seen a more of a positive shift in this direction of staff in many places are becoming more aware of taking a different approach. And then at the same time, there's that backing away and there's that feeling like, yeah, that I'm being asked to do things that, because a lot of times the first thought in a meeting around a child that is struggling and has had trauma impacts is we need to get them signed up with a therapist. Right. And so there's that piece of, okay, well, that's good. And there are some definite, there's a definite role that therapists might play in working with that child, but everything that child needs is not going to be provided by therapists. It's all those day-to-day interactions. It's all those opportunities to work on the child's nervous system, on repatterning their nervous system, what we call their baseline, right? Think of it as their thermostat, right? Repatterning that thermostat. And so, yes, we've seen a real uptick in terms of, kids that never experienced anxiety before. They're now having anxiety. And so many of the things that we were teaching educators to use for kids pre-COVID that had trauma impacts now apply so much more so for almost all kids, to help kids who, we're talking to all these staff of first and second graders who have all these kids who've not been in classrooms and they're in second grade, and they don't have all the regulatory skills and the social perception and all those different things going on. And so I think everything that we've been teaching for that percentage of kids before that was really struggling now applies to probably, it's probably the small percentage that it doesn't apply to in many ways or won't benefit them in some way.
Well, it's great to hear that there's an openness to learning about this, seeing the need for it. And like you said, understanding that IV drip of all those touch points.
Yeah.
So you presented at this conference the last number of years in the past, and previously you were talking about one of the other trainings that you do, and that one is your FBA is a fantasy. So can you explain why most people watching or their FBA might be a fantasy, and what really needs to change to better, help address that behavior?
Sure. Do you want me to? Oh, you want to open that out, or do you?
Well,
it is a fantasy.
It
We
is.
actually mean it. That's the first question people always
I
ask.
think the main thing is that traditional functional behavior assessments, where we use and behavior plans, which typically focus on consequences, right? The behavior is a function of its consequence, and we're going to reward to try to either get the behavior that we want to see, or we're going to use some form of aversive consequence to try to decrease the challenging behavior that we don't that we don't want to see. The thing is that can work for some kids, but for children that are experiencing toxic stress and trauma, it can be a bigger dose of stress than they can handle. And so I think that with if we think that we can use these traditional methods, which there's nothing wrong with them. They can work for some children, but typically it's, as I said, if we try this with kids that have toxic stress and trauma, we're just actually making the problem worse. In other words, we're activating an already overreactive and overactive stress response into a place where they can't meet our expectations again. So
our plan becomes the trigger.
Our plan becomes the trigger.
Or our behavior plan, yeah.
And we were just looking at the wrong thing. We were, instead of really focusing on the development of skills, making sure that we have a proactive regulation plan for kids. Because, one of the things I like to talk about is that what we as educators want to do is to access the cortex. If we don't access the cortex, we've really got nothing, do we? And so what are we going to do then in our behavior plans, in our FBAs, to really build plans that will create regulation for the child, give them an opportunity to when they do dysregulate, to re-regulate, and also just work on the physiology of the nervous system as well, maybe sensory activities and things like that. And so the focus, I think, of our plans is really having to do with really making sure that we address the nervous system, this mind-body connection, and that we don't just, we move farther and farther away from our conventional wisdom that, of punishments and rewards.
And I think the other major piece of it too, there's kind of a twofold, is that then we also want to look at because of toxic stress, because of trauma, neurocognitive skills will be underdeveloped. So the child's skills for social emotional regulation, which obviously we've talked about, but for things like cognitive flexibility and so forth, will be impacted, will be underdeveloped, or almost missing. And so the idea that we're seeing this behavior, so we ask an expectation, please take out your journal, please push your chair in, right? And it seems like and then the chair goes flying across the room. We're like, what did that have to do with, right? But that's because of some missing skills. For does every other kid want to push their chair in and go line up to go to math? Not necessarily. So what's the difference?
Right.
And the difference is the other 8 kids who really don't want to push their chair in and go line up for math group have some frustration tolerance skills. They have some skills to communicate their wants, their needs, a whole plethora of things that might be lagging. And so the idea that we need to make a plan that focuses on truly assessing where are they at in the area of these skills, how can we build those skills, make a plan that realistically looks at, this behavior. We can't consequence it out of a kid when they don't have the skill to meet it. It's just like you can't offer me $1,000 to go dunk a basketball, right? Do I want the 1,000? I'm pretty sure I do, but I can't dunk a basketball. I don't have the skill to do that. Right? Or do this interview with you in French, right? I think I can't do this interview, even if you offer me $5,000. It's this idea that no matter what motivational carrot we hang out there or consequence we threaten, if the child doesn't have the skill to meet that expectation, then we're setting them up for a lot of failure and triggering their behavior.
We can't make the impossible possible.
Right. Yeah, what you both have said, I think that's a great analogy. But when what you were saying, it works for some, but oftentimes it can have the reverse effect, and we've heard that from a number of our keynotes at the conference. I think this morning it got applause when I think Dr. Lori said nobody's going to care about stickers or some of the other positive things when they're in, a cognitive state that's not ready to receive that or understand the logic, like have the logic tools to really appreciate why it was designed that way. So, and that's the dunking the basketball metaphor or speaking in French in an interview or things like that.
Well, there's the intrinsic motivation piece too. If we all really think about it, I often, almost always, ask in training who in the room is signing up to follow this kid around when they're 29, offering a sticker, threatening a consequence, and no one raises their hand.
I had never thought of that. Yeah.
Figure out what, right? But truly, if we aren't thinking intrinsic motivation now, we are building human beings who are going to need that external, right? Extra external, which sets them up for a lot of forms of failure in adulthood. And so we really want to see our fellow educators grasp this piece about, please see this 9-year-old as a 29-year-old, see this 13-year-old as a 23-year-old, and work on that intrinsic, the things that, build intrinsic motivation, competence, build those skills, build the regulation, give them voice in the situation by taking certain approaches that we talk about. And so.
Well, I can tell you, excuse me, I know somebody who is in their 20s, right? And who, as a child, experienced a lot of the things where like stickers and some of the motivations really triggered her behavior. And it was getting the right plan for her and helping people who understood where she was coming from, changed her life around. And, went from struggling in school to excelling in school and now in her 20s, much, after school. So it's great that people like you are resources. I'm sure that there are going to be a lot of people who see the title of your session and show up tomorrow. So if you're not here with us in person or you can't attend their session, I believe we've been, there it is, the website information for how to get in touch with them and learn more about.
And ours is also being recorded as part of the online conference.
Oh, that's great, yeah.
So if they sign up for the online conference, they can actually see the full session.
Fantastic. So the in-person session, the online session, but then also the specific training services, get in touch with Doris and Rick and learn more. And thank you both for being here. Thanks for presenting in previous years, presenting this year, and thanks for being with us on Radio ATN.